Okay, hey everybody, it's week 10, and this is going to be a relatively short video lecture where we just talk about some of the basics of political geography, and then in class we're going to get much more into talking about electoral geography, and then next week into international geopolitics. But there's just some terms and things that I think it's good to put into this video here, so that we have some more time in class to talk about electoral geographies and other stuff. Also, after this video, make sure you watch the video on the Big Sort, which is a video about how people in the United States have essentially started moving into communities that are more homogeneous based on political values and voting trends. And it's a really interesting video that talks about how a lot of things have really shifted in the United States over the past 30 or so years, and why there's not as much cooperation or discussion across party lines and between liberals and conservatives and that sort of thing, why that's become more rare in the last several decades here in the United States, and some of what the consequences are. So make sure to watch that video after this one. In this section, though, I just wanted to talk about a few different terms that are important to kind of know here. And some of them I'm going to breeze over pretty quick because we've already talked about them in class. But first of all, just this definition, when I say political geography in terms of what that means, it's essentially just the geographic study of politics. Who would have thought, right? And political matters. And so a lot of times it's about how political apparatuses, like governments and things, try to manage space, why borders are put where they are, but also looking at patterns in terms of like voting behavior and that sort of thing, as well as how different countries sort of interact with each other across space around the whole world. And so that's what we're going to be getting into here the next couple weeks. And if you remember from a couple weeks ago, we talked about a few terms like state and nation and sovereignty and nation state and those sort of things. Just to kind of rehash this here a little bit. So keep in mind that when I say the word state, what I'm talking about here is sort of what we might usually think of as the government, a centralized authority that enforces sort of a single political legal system on a particular area. And so we might say that the Earth is, divided into roughly about 200 independent states, right? Governments that are kind of running these particular areas. And the reason, one of the things about the state as a term is it means more than just kind of who's in the White House. It's also the Congress, and it's also the courts, and it's also the police, and other institutions, as well as state governments and city governments, and all that sort of apparatus would be kind of considered the state. And this is a map of the states of the world, and as most people are probably familiar, this is like what we're doing in our map quizzes, right? We're looking at the way in which the Earth has been sort of chopped up into these different political groupings. And they're very important, and it's the way we're used to looking at the world, but it's important to note two things. One is this is only one way of thinking about how the world works. And the second thing to remember is that that at one point, none of these countries existed. The borders do shift and change, and will probably continue to change into the future. But this is the current sort of setup for how the world is organized politically. And that leads to this term sovereignty. And sovereignty, as you may recall from previous lecture, is essentially the idea that individual states control the political and economic affairs within their boundaries, right? They have sovereignty, means they kind of have political control. But one of the key things about the international system of countries is that it is sort of held together by the fact that, for the most part, states recognize each other's sovereignty. So in other words, one of the things that makes the border of the US and Canada somewhat stable is that not only does Canada recognize US sovereignty of everything south of that, the US recognizes the sovereignty of the Canadian government to manage everything to the north. And the French government recognizes that Canada is there, and the British government does, and Japan does. And so there's a sort of these agreements that this is what the territorial boundary should be. Now, of course, there are sometimes disagreements over who should have sovereignty over particular areas, and that's where things usually get interesting, as well as where conflicts can arise. And so there are examples like Taiwan, which operates essentially independently, but to the government in mainland China, they believe it to be part of the People's Republic of China, or that it should be under their sovereignty. There's also parts of northern India and the areas where India, Pakistan, and China come together where there's arguments over who should have sovereignty over those areas. So it's not always really clear. There's also still colonies. So like the United States controls places like Guam, like Puerto Rico, and there are people that question whether the U.S. should really be running it or if they should have their own independent sovereignty, right? Okay, but there's another complication with sovereignty, which is the difference between formal sovereignty and effective sovereignty. Formal sovereignty is sort of this, agreement. It's like who we officially think is in charge because other countries sort of agree with each other. So it's the kind of official who's in charge, right? But then there's something called effective sovereignty, and effective sovereignty is who's actually in control on the ground. So for instance, parts of the eastern Ukraine, which we've talked about in this class, are officially part of Ukraine, but right now Russia is effectively governing them and going to and running how things operate in those territories. And so, and then there are other places where the government may have very weak control. So, for instance, in Iraq, there are areas where the central government has weak control, and sovereignty may exist in the hands of others. Same with Syria. Also, even in places like, say, in Mexico, there may be areas where drug cartels may have more say about what's going on in certain parts of Mexico than the Mexican government. So effective sovereignty is not always who officially has it. Another kind of key term is just this idea that we sometimes refer to as territoriality, which is kind of this idea rooted in European history, which is the idea that one person or one group is supposed to have exclusive control over an area, that you don't share control. That a certain place belongs to just one country or just one government, or in the case of property, oftentimes the idea that it belongs to just a single person. And so this is this concept of territoriality, and it's important to note that this is not, this may be largely how the world is kind of set up at the moment, but there are many, many other ways in which it has been set up, and other cultural values that kind of question whether this is how the land should be run and divided up. And when we think about territoriality, it actually comes from the Latin word territorium, which is the area over which one is allowed to instill terror. In other words, it's the idea that when countries are sort of recognizing each other's sovereignty or territoriality, it's saying you can kind of police your people over there the way you want to. You have the right to instill terror and fear and control, and we will do that over here. And so it's sort of a recognition, and it kind of grows out of old Roman laws around who was allowed to sort of instill terror and therefore kind of control populations by fear in particular areas. So that's kind of where this comes from. And in terms of where territoriality, or this concept of territory came from, this is a quote by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who really kind of is obviously not a fan of territoriality, but he says, kind of where this came from. He says, the first person who, having enclosed a plot of land, took it into his head to say, "This is mine," and found people simple enough to believe him, was the true founder of civil society. What crimes, wars, murders, what miseries and horrors would the human race have been spared had someone pulled up the stakes or filled in the ditch and cried out to his fellow men, "Do not listen to this impostor. You are lost if you forget that the fruits of the earth belong to all and the earth to no one." In other words, there's this idea that at some point, every place on the planet was owned by nobody, right? I mean, that's true. At some point, there was no people and no organized, sort of states and things like that, and nobody really controlled any place, officially. And then somebody came on the scene and made a claim to it. And now all the places that we think of as having private property, whether it's your landlord that you pay rent to or whoever it might be, there's a history there where at some point, somebody in history staked it out and said, "Hey, this is mine," and got enough people around to recognize that and to justify that claim and to support it to make it stick, right? So originally, this comes back to this idea that some theorists have referred to as property is theft, right? This idea that people come in and whoever controls the area is essentially taking it away from everybody else's use. But this is then kind of the system that is perpetuated and that we are kind of surrounded by today, is that all of these different land plots were essentially staked out and taken at one point in time, and then maybe sold to somebody else or given to their children as an inheritance, etc. And then today we look around it, and every piece of land, for the most part, is under the control of somebody through this process of being taken by somebody at some point. And then those of us who weren't part of that process of actually taking land are kind of stuck with not necessarily having any unless we can come up with a whole bunch of money and buy it from somebody who originally took it for free. So there's definitely a lot of reasons to be kind of critical of this idea of territory. All right. But if we look at sort of the larger kind of national scene in terms of how nation states are, or how states are set up and how they kind of control territory, you know, we already talked a little bit about this distinction between a country and a nation, right? A nation is a imagined community, a group of people that believe that they are kind of together socially. And nationalism is therefore this sense of belonging to or self-identifying with a national culture. And it's something that we learn, that we acquire through our interactions and kind of our socialization as we grow up. And in the late 18th century is when the nation state was really proposed as sort of the ideal political geographic unit, right? That you're supposed to have one state, that everybody in that, you know, controlling a territory, and that everyone in that territory sort of thought of themselves as being all together. However, as we've also talked about, this frequently is not the case. And so the geographic boundaries of a nation is supposed to be identical with the territory boundaries of the state, but this doesn't usually happen. And so according to the book, they say that there are some nation states like Germany, Sweden, Japan, Greece, Armenia, Finland. These are examples, but honestly, in every one of those examples, I could come up with counter examples of people that live in those places that aren't necessarily considered to be part of the same kind of national group, maybe different ethnically, etc. So. And so then again, there's this idea that, so, you know, even by the book's relatively narrow definition, by the book's actual, I guess, actually kind of liberal definition, like they accept a lot of countries as nation states that I think is a little questionable, even those are the ones in red. But they also talk about in the book how there are many other different kinds of states out there that are much more multi-ethnic, multinational sort of states. And so, you know, states that have sizable ethnic minorities that don't necessarily consider themselves to be kind of part of that kind of idealized nation. And that's actually more the rule as opposed to the exception. And as you can see, almost all of Africa, but also India, and then areas with substantial settler populations and immigrants. Yeah. Then what I want to hit here is just also that depending on how a country is shaped, can also, just like the geography of it or the geometry of it, like what its shape is, can influence how well a particular state sort of holds together or not. Theoretically, the more compact the territory, the easier it is to govern, right? Because you can connect it all easier. You can put a capital right in the middle and kind of have good coverage. And, you know, also in theory, you'd have more cultural similarity if you're covering kind of a very compact space. So circular or kind of hexagon forms maximize compactness, shorter lines of communication, and, you know, also the amount of border that you have to defend is somewhat obvious, things like that. So Brazil, France, those are good kind of compact states. However, there's a whole bunch of times when that's not how it works. There are other what they call more unfavorable territorial distributions that can keep countries from really kind of coalescing together and staying together in quite the same way. And there's some terms here: an enclave, exclave, and a penenclave. And it's much easier for me to show them on a map, but these definitions are here in the PowerPoint. If you do need them, you can always pause this video and look out. And I'm sorry, my face is covering the word outlets here. So it says an intrusive piece of territory with only the smallest of outlets. A penenclave is like a peninsula. It's like a small area of a country that sticks into sort of another country. And then we have the term irredentism, which we've already seen, which is when people want to leave their country and potentially become part of the neighboring country. So here's some funky shapes. You have these elongated countries like Chile, which is not compact at all, right? And so they have a lot of territory to sort of cover from the north to south, whereas France and Brazil are much more compact. You have some countries that are spread out over a collection of islands like Indonesia. You have some countries like Lesotho, which is a enclave. It's completely surrounded by another country, right? Whereas South Africa is this larger area, but it has these chunks taken out of the middle, like Lesotho. You have the Gambia, which is a country that is a Pena enclave. It's just this very small, it's like surrounded on three sides by Senegal. And this also makes Senegal somewhat strangely shaped in that it has this whole region on the south side here that is somewhat disconnected, or you have to cross the Gambia to connect to this other part of Senegal. And there have been like independence movements and other things in this area called the Casamance region down here because they don't feel themselves to be particularly connected to the rest of Senegal. And so that's one of the problems with things like enclaves, elongations, is that sometimes you get separatism or irredentism because some of the areas that are far from the capital sometimes don't necessarily feel like they're really part of that state. And so there are parts of Indonesia that have independence movements, such as West Papua, which the Indonesians refer to as Irian Jaya. It's an area that's very different ethnically, and people in West Papua are very interested in having independence from Indonesia. There's a strong independence movement that the government in Jakarta in Indonesia has put down quite violently. There was also East Timor, which was part of Indonesia, but which recently, recently as in about 20 years ago, gained its independence and is now an independent country of East Timor. And part of that is also, again, because it's this fragmented state that Indonesia is trying to kind of hold together. There's also what are called exclaves. An exclave is when you have a chunk of your territory and there's some other country in the way between your main body of your territory and this other little piece. So for instance, there's an area called Kaliningrad, and this would be better if it also showed that Poland and the Baltic republics and things were here, like Lithuania, Latvia, etc. There's this little section of Kaliningrad here. So this white is not ocean, this white is other countries. Is Russia, but it's not connected to the main part of Russia. The United States has an exclave, right? Alaska. We have this whole chunk, but there's a whole bunch of Canada in the way between Alaska and the southern 48 states. And then you get examples like Pakistan, right, which we've talked about the partition of India and Pakistan. Pakistan originally, right, was created in 1947 with India in the middle and then West and East Pakistan on each side of it. West Pakistan held the capital in Islamabad and most of the territory. East Pakistan had most of the people. And West Pakistan kind of hoarded the country's wealth, exploited the East Pakistan's resources, big differences in terms of ethnicity and language, even though they were both Muslim areas. And eventually, East Pakistan broke off, and that that exclave seceded and became Bangladesh. Right? And so that was a separatist movement and that then eventually became a new country separate from the other part of Pakistan. And that's one of the problems about having a non-compact country shape, is that there's all sorts of reasons why it's hard to sort of hold that together into one country. Okay. So this is just an example. So this was West Pakistan here and East Pakistan here, which is now Bangladesh. And to get from one to the other, you either had to go all the way around on a ship or you had to cross, 1,000 miles or more of India, which has been a power that has had long kind of hostilities with Pakistan. A couple other points about boundaries and borders. Distinct borders are actually a relatively new phenomenon in the last 100 years or so. It used to be that large countries would have what they call marchlands between them, which was essentially a buffer zone that took like a day's march of an army to cross, and so it's sort of like a neutral zone between countries. But later, with more mapping technologies and things, now borders tend to be very, very distinct lines. There are other things called buffer states, and a buffer state is a small, independent, but fairly weak country that is somewhat between two countries that might tend to have animosity towards each other. So Mongolia, which is between Russia and China, or Nepal between India and China, would be kind of considered a buffer state, a state that exists between kind of two larger powers. There's another term called satellite state, which is similar, but it's not something, it's something that's kind of hard to use a contemporary example. But during the time period of the Soviet Union, a lot of times the countries of Eastern Europe were called satellite states. because they were small countries, relatively weak, that the Soviet Union really dominated, places like Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary. And so they weren't really completely independent because they were under really the sway of the Soviet Union, which was a powerful neighbor. And so those were sometimes called satellite states. And then in terms of like when borders became more solidified, there's a few different ways in which ways in which borders get drawn. Oftentimes borders will be what are called natural borders, and that's where some particular natural feature is used, like a coastline or maybe a river. So like, for instance, the border between Vermont and New Hampshire is the Connecticut River. That would be a natural border. An ethnographic border is one where there's some sort of cultural difference on one side or the other. So like India and Pakistan was a ethnographic border where Muslims were supposed to be on one side and Hindus on another. Of course, as we know, there was actually all sorts of people on both sides of the border, and that created all sorts of violence. But that's an example of like an ethnographic border, or something that's between sort of ethnic groups. Another kind of boundary is a geometric border, which essentially is just drawing a straight line on a map. So for instance, in the United States, most of our border with Canada is at 49 degrees north latitude, for the western part of the border anyway. So it's this line that just goes straight across North America, and Canada is north of that, and the US is south of that. That would be an example of a geometric border. Or the border between New Hampshire and Massachusetts is roughly, for the western part anyway, relatively straight. That would be another kind of geometric border. There's another term the book mentions called a relic border. Essentially, this is a border that no longer really functions as one. So it's like a previous border. Like, for instance, there used to be a very militarized and definite border between East Germany and West Germany. That's not there anymore. It's a relic. You can still find pieces of the wall or old border stations as like tourist attractions, but really there's no border there any longer. And then it's, of course, important to recognize that there are large cultural groups that think of themselves as nations that do not have states. And the Kurds is one great example, where there's Syria, there's Iraq, there's Iran, there's Turkey. And the Kurds are a huge, 25 million people that live across this whole region, but they don't have a state of their own. And so they have some autonomy in the northern parts of Iraq as part of Iraq, but a somewhat autonomous, like, kind of region of it. In Syria, during the civil war, some of the Kurdish groups were able to take over large chunks of territory and govern themselves autonomously for some time. But the Turkish government has been pretty brutal in its repression of Kurds that are interested in being separate from Turkey. And a lot of the reasons for some of these weird borders here, these border lines, you'll notice, are very straight. They're mostly geometric. They certainly are not ethnographic because they cut through the major ethnic groups of the area. But a lot of these borders were made up by the French and the British at the end of World War I, when they divided up the Middle East among themselves without any real regard for where different groups were. And this has created a lot of problems in the years after that. And so this is a point. Territorial fission is essentially when a country breaks apart into more than one. So it's kind of like separatism. So this has happened. It's not infrequent. Territorial fission has happened in places like what used to be Yugoslavia, split up into Serbia and Croatia and Slovenia and these other countries. South Sudan is a good example, one of the more recent, or the most recent state, when Sudan fissured and became two countries. And so this is something that happens when there's big differences within a country. But sometimes there's the flip side of that. So the opposite of when a country kind of splits apart is what's referred to as supranationalism. Supranationalism is when, not necessarily when a country comes together by combining countries, but when countries get together and give up some of their sovereignty, some of their ability to make their own decisions to get benefits of being in a larger group. The European Union would be a great example of supranationalism, because the countries in it, like Germany or Italy or Spain, they give up some of their ability to make economic decisions independently for the greater benefits of sharing one currency and one sort of economic policy and letting people migrate from one area to another. So that would be supranationalism. And connected to that, there's this idea of regional trading blocs, which is another form of supranationalism, when countries get together and say, well, we're not going to tax each other's goods, or we're going to, import and export things more smoothly between us, such as NAFTA, which is the North American Free Trade Agreement, where US, Canada, and Mexico kind of function together economically in some ways. And so there are a lot of these different types of supranational groups, European Union being the main one. But of course, some countries get upset with kind of feeling restricted on what they can do as an independent country within these groups. So like, for instance, Brexit, which we'll talk about in class a bit here in the coming weeks, has everything to do with the United Kingdom wanting to not be part of the European Union anymore, right? But there are some other supranational organizations, the Arab League, the Commonwealth of Independent States for a while, which is kind of some former Soviet republics kind of operating independent or collectively as well. And then some of the newest examples of kind of supranationalism might be shown by like the New Silk Road, which is a project that China is kind of putting together, where they're trying to link a lot of economies and also a lot of the technology to have railways that kind of fit together, etc., to kind of bring East Asia, Central Asia, and Europe, as well as Africa, into kind of more of a seamless kind of economic unit, operating both in terms of how infrastructure kind of connects them all and shipping connects it all, but also through agreements with each other to kind of trade things more frequently and to share, to have tourists move back and forth more frequently, as well as, other goods, and to have more trade and to kind of put together a larger kind of trading area. And so that would be another example to some degree of supranationalism, where some of the countries along these routes have to make concessions and compromises to kind of facilitate this greater movement of goods and people kind of between the different countries. So, all right, that's it for this particular video lecture. Don't forget to watch the next one on the big sort, and I will see you in class.